we sort of provide a platform for our members to have their own voice and connect to and influence policy levers throughout the country. I will also, do you mind clicking the next slide? Sure. So we are all over the US. This is just showing the contiguous 48 states, but we also have activity beyond just what you see here. We're divided up into 4 different regions in terms of our democratic structure, and our whole organization, including myself as executive director, we're all member-run, led, and governed. So we elect, our board is directly elected 100% from within our membership. So these are worker owners who sit on our board and hire and supervise me. I'm also a worker owner and a member of a business that's inside of our membership. And so we organize programs regionally on the ground, sometimes at the state level, and of course federally, which is most of what we're going to be talking about today. This is a picture of our board over there and staff. And now I want to kick it over to our sister organization, the Democracy at Work Institute.
Hi, everyone. My name is Melissa Hoover. I'm the executive director of the Democracy at Work Institute, and I'm the former executive director of the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops, also a former worker owner and co-op developer. So I've been in this work for 15 years. The Democracy at Work Institute is about 5 years old, and we were founded by the Federation to sit next to it and do the research, education, and training that supports the existing worker co-ops as well as growth of future worker co-ops and sort of ties them together. So grounding future growth in our current community, but really with an expansive eye towards scale-oriented initiatives. And so, you know, our mission is expanding democratic worker ownership to communities most affected by inequality of all sorts. And so we were founded to do sort of exactly the thing that we're doing now in this initiative, working alongside the Federation as the Think and Do tank next to their grassroots member-led organization. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. And want to just give a brief mention to one of our initiatives, which is the Workers to Owners Collaborative. It's a national network of practitioners supporting worker co-op development and other forms of employee-owned businesses, founded a couple years ago, convened by Dowie, but really driven by its members who are practitioner organizations across the country. I think it's up to about 15 or 16 member organizations now. And I bring them up because these Workers to Owners members were really critical. They advised on the Main Street Employee Ownership Act, and then they'll be key implementers in their fields of work. And so they'll come back up later. Keep an eye out for them. I think I'm going to hand it back now to, oh, sorry, no, still me. So I'll review our agenda just so you know where we're headed in the next hour, in the next, 53 minutes. We've done introductions. We're going to spend the bulk of our time on the Main Street Employee Ownership Act. What is it? Sort of piece by piece, helping you all understand its implications for your work and for the field. We'll talk a little bit about how we got here, because how we got here was a pretty amazing consortium of organizations alongside really critical political allies. And then we'll talk a little bit about what this means for worker co-ops in the US specifically, and then more broadly, what's next? How are we implementing this, and how are we working together, and how can you support and plug into that work? Then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end.
All right, so we're going to get right into it with kind of talking about what is the Main Street Employee Ownership Act. So as Melissa said, we'll have Q&A at the end, but if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat window, and we'll keep track of those for later. So the Main Street Employee Ownership Act, it is an act that has been in the works for more than a year now. We're so excited that it finally was signed into law on August 13th. This legislation is mostly about directives, right? So it is directing the Small Business Association of the US to, number one, finance the sale of businesses to employees. So normally we would call it those conversions. work with the small business development centers across the country to provide training and education on employee ownership options. And those small business development centers are basically like local hubs for the SBA. They're offices that you can go to and just kind of get training and materials for any kind of small business. So in addition to that, we also have reporting on SBA's lending and outreach to employee-owned businesses. So that is a lot about helping us to understand, like, what is it in the field that we need to know? What are the major benchmarks about how much money is being lent out to employee-owned businesses, things like that. And so right now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to walk through a bunch of the different sections. We'll talk a little bit. A few of us will share. The first section is just definitions, and we wanted to take this opportunity to go through it piece by piece so that you can kind of see, like, what is it that makes up a piece of legislation, because there's a lot of jargon in there, so we kind of distilled it down to everyday talking points and pieces of information that you can digest. And then what we'll do afterwards is we'll actually share with you kind of the full legislative language, so you can kind of look at it together and learn what each piece means. So usually most pieces of legislation start off with definitions. So what do we mean when we refer to different things? So administration means a small business administration. Cooperatives, as defined on SBA's website, is a business or organization owned by and operated for the benefit of those using its services. Employee-owned business concern. So in addition to the work with worker cooperatives and democratic businesses that we do, there are also employee trusts called ESOPs, the employee stock ownership plans. So when we talk about employee-owned business concerns, we're talking about cooperatives and ESOPs together. And small business development centers, as I said, they deliver programs and services to the small business community, and they work in tandem with the SBA. And I'm actually going to hand it over to Tim to talk a little bit more about Section B.
Tim, we're having trouble hearing you.
Nope. I think you should come in here. Why don't you just come and sit in my chair?
What's wrong with my
This
sound?
one?
Can I sit in your chair?
Yeah, sit right here.
Hello. Can folks hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, sorry about that delay. I had some technical difficulty. I'm the research director at the Democracy at Work Institute. And so 7A loans, those are loans that the Small Business Administration already gives out to small businesses, fairly standard set of loans. What the Main Street Employer Ownership Act does to make them more useful for cooperatives is threefold. One, it clarifies that the seller may remain involved in the business and still get one of these loans, which wasn't necessarily clear before. Depending on the type of conversion you have, sometimes the seller stays on, sometimes they don't. But that status shouldn't affect whether you're able to get one of these loans or not. Secondarily, they have the option now to not require mandatory equity to back the loan. It's not clear exactly what will be their criteria for choosing who is required to have mandatory equity and who isn't. And actually, that's one of the things that we need to work with them on during implementation, but now it is an option to at least do that. And then lastly, the SBA is going to guarantee loans made by a cooperative, meaning that if the loan fails, the full weight and force of the U.S. government is behind the loan. And it's important to note, though, that doesn't mean that the SBA will be giving the loans themselves. They usually work through other private financial institutions to give the loans, but they back them and guarantee them.
And this is probably a great opportunity for us to talk a little bit about, like, what do we mean by these loans? So as Tim said, they are administrated through different lending organizations, and SBA guarantees them. So while this isn't, the SBA isn't giving out loans directly, this is a huge step forward in our ability to actually make sure that funds are going towards worker cooperatives.
Right. So the next slide, this is the sections in the bill that start to talk about how they're going to do outreach. The main form of outreach will be to Sbdcs, the Small Business Development Centers, which we'll get to in a second. But it also directs the SBA to do some outreach directly to investment companies and microloan programs and provide those groups with outreach and educational materials so that the investment community has better understanding and more information at its fingertips to facilitate conversions and employee ownership.
Cool. And all right, so a little bit more about Small Business Development Center outreach and assistance. With this act there's the establishment of the Small Business Employee Ownership and Cooperatives Promotion Program that's going to offer technical assistance and training. It's going to help people do things like succession planning, exploring this idea of conversion from maybe a traditional business structure into a worker cooperative or an ESOP. So that's actually the process of kind of like moving over. So making sure that, we're moving businesses to the workers, both in ownership and in the case of cooperatives in governance. And we're making sure that we're doing that in a really healthy way. So there's a lot of work to be done in kind of educating people about what does that mean? Because for a lot of people, it's a brand new thing. So in addition to that, there's actual leadership training, so on a more personal level, around management, governance, and operations. So, what does it mean to be a manager in a workplace where all the workers have a piece of the governance and a piece of the ownership? So, and then thirdly, we have the understanding of financing options. So it's helping people understand where can you get funding, where can you get these loans from, and how do you go about not only like starting a business, but converting one. And just to give you like a quick snapshot, so what you're seeing on the screen now is a list of different kinds of organizations that the Small Business Development Centers will be working with. They'll be making outreach to. In some cases, we'll be helping to educate them. This is by no means a comprehensive list, but we just wanted to give you a little bit of a snapshot of what are the kinds of organizations that, that we're talking about here. So we're talking about cooperative development centers, like Northwest Cooperative Development Center up in the Pacific Northwest, that are actually doing the work of developing cooperatives. America's Sbdc, which is the network of small business development centers across the country. Of course, the Democracy at Work Institute and organizations like it that are providing technical assistance and helping do some of the research and kind of like background and development work that R&D is so important in kind of like growing the worker cooperative field. And same with Project Equity and the ESOP Association. So while we'll be focusing on the worker cooperative side, we want to acknowledge and share that the ESOP community has helped to drive a lot of this forward. So we'll be working in tandem with them in the future. So that includes, let me see, we talked about ownership associations, service providers, local, regional, and national cooperative associations. So that's, for instance, us, the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives, the National Center for Employee Ownership, NCBA-CLUSR, which is the National Cooperative Business Association. They work with not only worker cooperatives, but all cooperatives. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, community development, financial institutions, lenders like the Opportunity Finance Network. So as you can see here, there's a lot of different moving parts and there's a lot of different kinds of partners. And we hope that, we'll be doing a lot of outreach in the future. And we hope that a lot of you on this call, I know will be partners in that. And we hope to grow the worker cooperative movement through this work of making sure that these SBA directives actually get to where they need to go to.
Great. And near the very end of the bill is what most people might consider the least interesting part, but For me as research director, I always like these parts of bills. This is actually the data part, right? This is what did the program actually do? How does this bill working? So Section F directs SBA to do a report to Congress on an annual basis on the status of all these employee-owned firms. So it's gonna track the number of loans that it gives out to socially and economically disadvantaged individuals. It's going to track the number of cooperatives it serves and the number of employee-owned businesses. And the reason why this is so important, even though that's just a tiny bit of information, is because, to my knowledge, this is the first time the federal government will be doing any sort of data tracking on worker cooperatives in a comprehensive way. ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans, have a lot more data at the federal level than worker co-ops, but now worker co-ops will be able to access sort of a national set of data for the first time. And secondarily, the other report that this is a one-time report, but another report that it's going to do is that it's going to study and recommend the practical alternatives to satisfy the loan guarantee requirements of the SBA, particularly because even though that's in the bill that you're supposed to be able to get loan guarantees through the SBA, this has been a problem in the past, and they want to be thorough and have the best possible alternatives to facilitate cooperative lending. So both the one-time cooperative lending bill or report and the annual report on the status of employee-owned firms are really, really useful tools to set up this thing long-term.
And I would add, this is Melissa, just to jump in, I would add a practical kind of action step to keep in mind here for those of you on the phone. We'll talk about it more when we get to implementation, but I want to plant the seed that what the federal government has to measure these things in order for to sort of gauge the impact of the program. And what the government measures is what will matter. And so for us to think about syncing up our activities to their measurements, being really savvy about what they're already measuring, and then making sure that we are also in a position to measure that and to help them measure it is like critically important. As Tim said, not a thing people necessarily think about first, but is actually what's going to help us kind of drive and expand starting from this opportunity. So plant that seed.
That sums it up for me. I was going to say the same thing, is that we do collect data ourselves, as a movement. We do annual surveys and other ways of collecting data, but we need all data sources to speak to each other and to do so in a way that promotes growth in the movement. So, something to keep in mind as we go forward.
And now we'll hand it over to our Executive Director, Spawn Kelly.
I like how we're actually literally shuffling chairs. This is hilarious. So, see what we're up to here. Right. Okay. So the question then is, how did we get here? This actually involved a fairly long process, an intensive process, where we've been in conversations with legislative staff, both in the House and on the Senate side as advisors. We talked to a lot of partners in our space, worker co-op developers, and some of you who are on the call. And we also very much engaged with the employee ownership organizers. So a lot of the ESOP community had been involved in legislative visits on the Hill for a while, and that's a big part of what was able to push this work forward. So once they were able to garner that interest on the Hill, we were able to tap various partners to think about, okay, well, how do we actually shape this, and what matters, what are the pressure points in terms of lending, in terms of scale, in terms of financing, and especially for the conversions work that's been evolving. We'll take a look in that a little more in depth in a second, but did you, either Melissa or Mo, want to add to some of how we got here?
I just want to underscore, I think what you're already saying, it takes a long time, and I think as the national organization representing worker co-ops, we know, that's something that's hard to work in, right, to the day-to-day of running a business. And we really appreciate and value the trust that the members have put in us, not only to go out and do outreach to legislative bodies at every level of government, but also are giving us the opportunity to actually just listen and hear what are the challenges, what are the things that we actually need to work on to make it easier for worker cooperatives to come into existence. So it's a really long road, and I think our membership has been really supportive of it and involved in the sense of participating in our councils and helping us to have kind of like our ear to the ground as to what it is we need to be advocating for.
And I'd like to give a shout out to Senator Gillibrand's staff, who were incredible to work with. You know, they initiated much of this discussion. They did really strong due diligence in the field. They were responsive to our concerns, and they brought a really nuanced understanding of employee ownership. So I think I have not worked with many Senate legislative staff, but I understand that I've been spoiled for all future interactions because they were just amazing to work with. So I think, you know, we should recognize that, and Senator Gillibrand's vision in bringing this forward. It was clear that it had traction from the very beginning, and that she was able to, and that her staff was able to enlist bipartisan allies, and a large part of that, I think, back to the kind of long time horizon on this stuff is actually a lot of the organizing and relationships that had been built in the field between ESOPs and worker co-ops, between our communities and our organizations, and then some of our senior advisors, who we'll get into on the next slide, really laid strong groundwork. So that when the time was right, and who knew that this moment in time would be the right time, but it is, that when the time was right, you know, we could actually push something. So.
And so that's what this is illustrating right here. If you look at some of the logos of our allies and partners involved in this advocacy, that top line there is a lot of our groups. This is especially Joseph Blasi at Rutgers, but the American Sustainable Business Council, as well as NCBA CLUSA. Those are all folks who were major partners in being informed and even being directly in touch with the staff in Senator Gillibrand's office, and whom we consulted with on each of the drafts as they were coming out, and we were reviewing policy ideas. And then the next row, starting with NCB and the ESOP Association. That was the top. Yeah, okay, so the next row were our advocacy partners. And then you'll see some of the other groups who we both were in discussions with and who are gonna be part of our implementation phase in rolling this out. So groups like the National Urban League, certainly ICA Group, the Working World, and Project Equity. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I wanted to jump in and just recognize a couple groups specifically that the ESOP Association made this part of one of their top lobbying priorities this year during their Hike the Hill. So they turned out 500 members. They provided lobbying briefs to them. And those folks spoke to senators on, you know, both sides of the aisle. So everyone gave input to the process, which is another remarkable thing about Senator Gillibrand's staff. All of the organizations listed here had something to say about the drafting and the sort of the priorities. And then some of the organizations like the ESOP Association really, you know, and then those top level partners really advocated and lobbied for it. And then just briefly, the Urban League endorsed it. And that's an example of a long relationship that we've been building with a partner who's not employee ownership is not their number one issue, or even really necessarily an organizational priority at this point, but they're interested in it. So they're interested in seeing this pass. So just if you're wondering what's the Urban League doing there, you know, they're interested in employee ownership for their own reasons.
Right. That was a part that I was going to underscore, that the ESOP Association's lobbying efforts really was the game changer. I mean, that's really why Senator Gillibrand was able to gain so much traction, was when they mobilized their members to get 500 of them on the Hill to do these visits. It really did open up a lot of doors. And so that's going to be part of our ask toward the end of this webinar, but just to spoil that a little bit right now, that being connected, being plugged in, and also being mobilized, whether that's directly for worker co-ops or for various local partners, co-op developers, and associations, to even just be there to do that face-to-face time, even from an educational standpoint, even if you don't have a specific ask, to just say, we're here, we're in your district, we're in your state, and these are programs that already exist that we care about, or things that exist on paper but that need funding and that need support. But to start to build a relationship and just get in their ear that you exist and that we're out there, the visibility is a big part of continuing the momentum that we have so far.
And Esteban briefly touched on this, but just kind of what it takes to actually make these things happen. What I love about this is it pushed us to move outside kind of like our normal, normal who's who, into kind of like seeing like what are the partnerships and what are the different pluses of different kinds of organizations and different sectors that are able to help push forward this work. So it's building those external partnerships that I think is really helping not only to get this pushed forward, but also to just spread the worker co-op structure as a whole. And I mean, that is increasingly a really big important part of our work is building relationships and understanding like how our values are in line with others' values. And we do a lot of that work through, we do work with our members through the Policy and Advocacy Council, through our technical assistants with those organizations who are also working with their own local organizations. Especially when we go and do member visits and engage with members on the ground, we're able to see like, what's the special sauce in each region of the country that allows for these things to happen. So, for instance, we're in Philly, and understanding like, who are the major players in this region that can help do a lot of this advocacy. So we can do that both on the local level through our membership, but then also on this kind of like big national level, understand a lot of these partners that Esteban and Melissa already talked about.
So can we talk about what it means kind of immediately? The first piece of that, I find maps really helpful and illustrative. So let's start with this, which is a map of the Workers to Owners Collaborative. And what you see here, the little toolkit suitcases in blue are places where DOWI's Workers to Owners Collaborative members exist. So some of them are headquartered in the places where they're mapped out, but do work regionally or nationally. And some of them really just work in their own backyard, but that's what the blue is. And the red represent either individual businesses or clusters of deals that have happened in the city where conversions have happened. And so then to sort of tease this out, flesh this out, next slide. This is kind of what this could mean, is that by supercharging that through this policy lever of working with the small business development centers, we could really expand the impact on the ground of what kinds of conversion deals happen, how we garner this interest as part of the silver tsunami, and this interest in coming up with a succession plan for retiring business owners all across the country, including in places where we aren't necessarily right there on the ground and we don't necessarily have reach or penetration, that this could be where this goes. One more slide.
Got it.
You got it? Okay, so we are already, it brings a lot of this work that we've been organizing within our field into a national focus, which I think is really helpful and important. We've already been hearing interest from both state and local offices in learning more about worker cooperatives and employee ownership just in the, what has it been, 2 weeks since this was signed into law. And as we started discussing the chat over here on this side, it hasn't even been implemented and rolled out yet. So we're already hearing this interest. And then a lot of national and even international news outlets have expressed interest in finding out more, starting to educate a broader public, because this does have mainstream implementation for the business community, for small businesses. So I think the implications are this has already done some of that work. And I think just thinking about the ways that we can amplify the Workers to Owners Collaborative, the impact of that strategy toward getting worker ownership to scale, and even deepening our partnerships with the employee ownership community, and building up interest in the fuller cooperative community and not just worker co-ops. This is kind of a flashpoint in that broader arc of change.
Great. So I want to pause actually just for a minute because I realized not only did we not formally introduce Esteban Kelly, superstar presenter you just heard from, that's Esteban. We also didn't really take a minute to say, holy cow, let's celebrate this. This is the first employee ownership federal employee ownership legislation in 20 years, in more than 20 years. It is evidence of our growing profile and hopefully political power, and it's also an opportunity and a platform to increase both of those things. So it's huge. We're here to celebrate. we went straight into like, let's get this business done, because I think that's really cool, like what needs to happen, and it's where our heads are. But just if we stop and take a breath, like, wow, look at what we've managed to achieve. And so I think that's sort of that feeling of urgency is and celebration are together, and they inform the implementation plan. So you know, getting the legislation passed is really half the battle. The other half is getting it implemented in a way that makes it usable by us. So a few things to know about implementation. This is an unfunded mandate. So it directs SBA to do things that it doesn't have money for, which means SBA has to reallocate resources internally, which means that it's an uphill battle, right? It's not coming with any money attached to it. So I think we can't assume that this will be a priority at SBA or is a priority. I think we have to make it a priority. And we do that through relationships and you know, support for SBA to prioritize it. And then we also do that by making it easy for them. So as an unfunded mandate, you know, it will be laying groundwork. Our job is to translate what we do and sync up with what already exists, with what already are the priorities at SBA, as measured by their sort of fairly rigid metrics. Like all federal agencies have fairly rigid metrics. So we have to understand those and then, you know, adhere to them in our work, and then use that to push forward and ask for money. Right? Make an appropriations play, ask for modifications that make sense for what we're doing. But right now we're in an all-out sprint to first understand and then sort of sync up with and translate with SBA. So we have the first two pieces there of the implementation plan are really research, input gathering from our community, data gathering, understanding what's on the ground, and then writing the regulations. So we have 90 days by federal law. Once it's signed into law, we have 90 days to implement that. And by we, I mean the Small Business Administration has 90 days to implement it. Our role in that is to help them. So we're looking at you know, we'll build relationships with SBA via some of the bill sponsors and via NCBA, via the ESOP Association, the groups that have those relationships. We will help SBA write regulations that make sense. The good thing is the law is written well. So it's written broadly enough and with enough of our input that it looks good for us. But we have to push the implementation to make sure that it meets our needs, right? As someone pointed out in the questions, conversions take longer, so we may need to have progress metrics. We'll need to have, to better understand how the Sbdcs do their work, whether and how they subcontract. Are we already working with Sbdcs? And sort of figure out from a lot of that intelligence how the regulations can be written in a way that actually helps advance worker co-ops and other employee-owned forms. So those are the first two. Are the sort of the nerdy back end, right? Research and the legal writing on the regulations, and then they are equally sort of importantly supported by the last three, which are building relationships that help those things happen. So the first is really building working relationships on our end on the employee ownership communities and with SBAs and the Sbdcs. So we may try some pilot projects. We've in our research, we've already uncovered several active relationships, and I noticed that there are some Sbdc staff on the phone, which is incredible. So, you know, we're already seeing Sbdcs supporting feasibility studies, referring out to TA providers. So we're gathering sort of catalog of those things and the pilots that are already happening. And then we'll probably focus on one or two friendly and related, you know, sort of where the work is already happening, Sbdcs, and see if we can do a pilot and then populate that, you know, throughout the community. The second sort of people relationship aspect of the work is really educating Sbdcs on and figuring out, you know, what they do, what we do, developing standardized trainings and materials, and translating sort of our work into their universe. And then finally, there's a decent amount of education back out to the worker ownership field to make sure that we're speaking the language of Sbdcs and understanding what their sort of constraints and priorities are. So beyond, and that's, you know, the first two really need to happen within the first 90 days. The last three are years-long projects, but I want to sort of emphasize that I think it's really important for us to be doing this as quickly and as forcefully as possible, sort of turning out a wave of interest and helping meet metrics and, you know, making a showing and a splash early on, so that when we have an appropriations push or when there are opportunities to expand the program, we can show real results. The last thing I'll say about implementation is that there are other pieces of legislation pending. This is just the first of a suite of pieces of legislation. It focuses on the SBA, but there will be others. Ideally, I'm not sure when and sort of the timeline, but there are other senators, including Senator Gillibrand, interested in sort of employee ownership.
Can I add just one piece, Melissa?
Please, yeah.
Yeah, so just speaking about the Sbdc relationship part, I mean, that's going to be really central to how well this rolls out and how much we can tout it in the future is how those relationships go. And those pilot ideas are really crucial. I mean, to give you an idea, there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Sbdcs around the country, right? And the chance of interfacing with every single one of them is pretty unlikely. Just because of sheer scale. So that's both a good and a bad thing, right? It's a good thing in the sense that the potential reach of Sbdcs, I mean, business clients as they touch, and all those people that could be informed about employee ownership is amazing. But to be effective, I think figuring out what those best relationships are, where are the pilot projects that we really want to highlight and work with and support, is crucial to figuring out where this goes. And so, you know, shout out to everybody in the Sbdc community that is already a champion of employee ownership, and also let's educate some more folks in that community who are yet to really understand the form. That's it.
And what a great segue into how you can engage with the next steps within the Main Street Employee Ownership Act.
So this is the very direct link for those of you who are not working already with Sbdc on how you can plug in and make this legislation matter. The first is just to share your story with us, that part of how we can do our job is by hearing what your experiences are, so that we can do some of this communications work and advocacy work of sharing with SBA how to connect your cooperatives with funds, what those pressure points are, what's working and not working, what could be better. Secondly, we need your help. As Tim was starting to say, there are so many of these centers. So not only knowing where they are, which, you know, we can do research and find where they are, but where those relationships are. If you have relationships, whether they're formal or informal, knowing who within our network is connected up already, and what kind of work and what kind of relationship and education they're doing with Sbdcs is really going to help us to build a solid foundation in doing this work. So stay in touch and let us know what you're up to. Even if that's just rumors, let us know what you've heard about what other folks are up to so that we can follow up on that, right? We can do the legwork in the research, but we do want to get the word out that it's important that you partner with us and that you help us figure that stuff out. Third, and this is probably more applicable to everyone on the call, is to become a sustainer of the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. That's what gives us some of the flexibility of extra resources to dedicate time toward new initiatives, toward following up on opportunities like this that have come up. Like when we get a phone call or an email out of the blue from someone in the House or someone in the Senate or someone in a city council somewhere, usually sustainer funds are the only thing we can pull from to allocate the resources to make that happen, with just a few exceptions. So I also want to thank those of you who are on the call who have been sustainers over the years, or have managed to renew your sustainership if it lapsed. So thank you. That's really a big part of how we've been able to make this happen. And the third important resource around this is from our members. So whether you are an allied organization, you can join as an associate member. If you're a cooperative, you certainly can join as a democratic workplace or a worker co-op member, or even a cooperative developer. If you have questions about that, we can deal with that and answer your questions about which membership category you fit into or what that looks like to get you linked into membership, or phase that in over time. But our member programs are really what allow us to make this stuff happen. So the Policy and Advocacy Council is our first go-to, not only for sourcing good ideas or learning for what has worked or what hasn't worked, things that have been successes on the ground that we decided actually this wasn't that effective, and we learned that lesson the hard way from one particular county, and so we can advise another county elsewhere across the country. This is where we share all of that information with each other as peers. And then it's also the first group we go to vet legislation when it is proposed, including the info that was coming down the pike from Senator Gillibrand's office.
Great.
Mo, how do we want to handle Q&A? I noted there were some in the chat that I know the answers to. I think people know the answers to others of them.
Why don't you kick it off, Melissa, and we'll tag team as we go through.
Okay, I'll take sort of the ones that I know. And so the 90-day question, so there's a question, will they be writing regulations in 90 days? I thought just the interagency working group would be formed in the first 90 days. So the first thing to know, we didn't mention it here actually, the interagency working group was struck at the last minute, literally hours before it passed. So there will not be a special interagency working group for this initiative. It is my understanding that we have 90 days to support the writing of the regulations. Now, the nuance there is that SBA could take as long as they want. It could take, months up to a year, to implement. I think we have to operate on a 90-day time window because that's the most sort of conservative approach. Why is the bill in the National Defense Authorization Act? Well, I think that's a making of the sausage type of question, like you get in where you fit in. I'm not sure there's really any logic other than that's where we thought it could pass, or that's where Senator Gillibrand's staff, to be more specific, thought that it could pass.
I think it's important to note that this kind of thing happens a lot. Putting a bunch of bills together in an omnibus bill is something that happens really regularly because the act of, bringing every single piece of legislation to a vote is very, very time consuming. So a lot of times what happens is, if you've heard the word omnibus before, we'll just package bills together so that they can say universal yes to a bunch of bills all at the same time, even if they're not really related, which is the case here. It's not atypical of a national bill, and this, we still talk about it as the Main Street Employee Ownership Act because it is its own thing.
And because just procedurally, that was the mechanism by which it got through the Senate. Mm-hmm. And was eventually signed into law, but it actually cleared the House as its own act. Mm-hmm. So let's not lose sight of that. It's just that the Senate is compromised in a lot of different ways, as we're mostly familiar with. So it was its own amendment and attached as a rider amendment to that omnibus bill. It wasn't like integrated into the details of the Defense Act. It was just sort of hitching a ride.
One last thing I'd add about the omnibus bill process is that one reason it's used is it can often be quicker, right? And this bill actually flew through from drafting to shopping around the floor to passage in really speedy time with super majority bipartisan support in an era where nothing passes Congress. So I think if we being Senator Gillibrand's office had tried to do this without an omnibus bill, we might still be waiting for it.
Yeah. So two other questions on implementation. One, will we work with the ESOP Association to cooperate so it works for both co-ops and ESOPs? Absolutely. We've already had discussions with the ESOP Association and a meeting with NCEO later this week, the National Center for Employee Ownership, to talk a little bit more about what implementation looks like. I think for ESOPs, this is not as critical. Most of the deal sizes with ESOPs are larger, but that doesn't mean we should not be attentive to how it could benefit them. So that's a key part of the implementation plan. There will be an implementation working group that forms to do research and support the implementation. I think to a couple of the other implementation questions, on what other measurements will Sbdcs track in the short and medium term, given that conversions happens on a much longer timeline than some of the assumptions baked into Sbdc support for startups. That's exactly the kind of question we're addressing ourselves to right now. I don't have a specific answer other than to say that's top of the list, is to develop some of those progress measures, or to figure out how we can work within the existing metrics to get to show progress. And similarly, the question about are we certain that the Sbdcs, that this will be executed well, the directives will be executed well? I don't think we can be certain about that. I think we have to sort of lay out a multi-point plan to make sure that it's executed well. And so that's what the working group is for. And those of you who are particularly interested in plugging into that, there will be avenues for you to give that kind of input.
Did you want to take the question on Section F?
Sure, I'll do my best with this one. I'm not sure I'll get it exactly right, but so my understanding is that the loans that SBA has made have been in the past to individuals, and that's been one of the sticking points for how useful they've been for cooperatives, who obviously have more than one person who is an owner and wants a loan. I do know of one instance in Seattle where Patty Pan Cooperative, which was a conversion, did get an SBA loan, but they had to jump through a lot of hoops, and in the end, the selling owner who stayed on for at least a little bit had to essentially act as an individual in order to get the loan and back it with her own collateral, which is exactly what we don't want to happen in the future. So this report on how to make this process better for cooperatives will have to tackle questions like that in a real way.
And I think it's also important to note that I think in the actual slide it said the number of loans made to socially and economically disadvantaged individuals, because there's sort of a compounding, right? So there are things called set-asides for the loans that can cover things like women-owned businesses, low income, and all the different kind of like federal legislation outlines of what does socially and economically disadvantaged mean. So one of the efforts that we'll be doing in this kind of like initial reporting period is understanding like what are the barriers that are actually keeping people from getting these loans, and how can we what do we as a sector actually recommend as a way to help shift those roles so that they can be more welcoming to worker-owned businesses. And there are a couple questions about the requirement of personal guarantees, and that's going to be a part of it, right? So the recommendations that we have to kind of gather are, how are people doing lending to worker cooperatives right now? Which some of that we do know, and we'll be doing further research on that, and how like we know that that's a barrier, right? But SBA doesn't necessarily fully understand that. And, so I think it's an important opportunity for us to be able to say, like, here are the challenges and here's how we've seen successful loans happen. Melissa or Tim, do you want to add to that?
Just to hammer home the point of getting people's stories is really important here. Is how we do research on this is your stories. There's no other source of information about how SBA interfaces with worker co-ops other than everyone who's tried it, right? And so your stories and anyone you know who's ever tried to interface with the SBA on loans first, but also technical assistance, anything else, is really, really useful. And getting those stories, first step, and then the second step is sort of organizing them, analyzing them, and coming to the table with the best set of recommendations on how to fix them.
Or I would say not just exclusively to actually engaging with SBA, but anyone who's been part of even prospecting about conversion. Mm-hmm. It's helpful to hear that story of why they didn't, or what that process was of them even finding you or finding whoever they did end up working with, or what was the moment where they threw up their hands or got a better deal or did something that was more conventional and easier. Those are still helpful stories because it helps, right? It helps us to figure out, well, what are the ways in which we do need to work with SBA to make this process easier, or to make this legislation more robust.
And I think in addition to your stories of success or difficulty with SBA or Sbdcs, we also need to be able to show our new partners that we have expertise as a field in doing this. So, we'll want to offer a set of best practices and recommendations to SBA that will be sourced from our cooperative lending partners. How do you underwrite co-ops? What are your member equity requirements? We know that SBA is going to probably default to its regular kind of way of doing business, maximum member equity, personal guarantees. And so in order to push back on that, we have to be able to say, well, look, Co-op Fund of New England, the Working World, Shared Capital Cooperative have all, these like minuscule loss rates, and here's how they do it. So that we can, and then here's how they interface with TA providers, and here are some of the TA needs that they're seeing. So I think there's a role for kind of offering vision and best practice that we will for sure be sourcing from the field. And to the question about a credit union that works with, it has a co-op specific investing program, how can we support the new momentum of this new legislation with the program? I think the very first thing is just to share your current successes, and then secondly, we'll be working together with everybody who's interested in how this might sync up with current practice and making some recommendations. So if you have thoughts on that already, please send them along.
And I know there was a little bit in the chat about that, but that's why this next, what do we have now, like 75 or 80 days really matter, mm-hmm. because this is our timeline for ramping up the implementation on this, and before the ink is dry and all the T's are crossed and the I's dotted.
I saw a question here about future legislation. So we've mentioned a couple of times that this bill is about directives. It's telling the SBA that its program needs to be inclusive of employer ownership. In the future, this sets us up for appropriations. So this sets us up to actually be in a place where people understand what worker cooperatives are, number one. Number two, they have a handle on what are the challenges and and particularly what are the impacts. We have all this data about how worker cooperatives create more stable jobs, and they create like a better whole life for the workers, and give them a place to have voice. If you're on this call, you're on board with that, and I think it's important to note that this is what sets us up to be able to get in front of people's faces and say, this is why you should be appropriating money directly towards worker cooperatives. So it's all kind of like a long road towards more and more funds being funneled towards the movement.
And then Gillibrand's office, I think, I don't want to speak out of turn and put them on the hook for anything that we're not sure about, but it's my understanding that they have 2 other bills dealing with other parts of government that they would like to introduce. And in his coverage of this in Nonprofit Quarterly, Steve Dubb goes into some detail in mentioning what some of the other legislation is. So I'll refer you to that because it's not on the top of my head right now.
And just one more plug for data. This is, to Mo's point, like, if we have lots of good data that people are using SBA loans and going to Sbdcs for technical assistance and employee ownership issues, and that shows up in the annual report to Congress, that is going to be a big piece into whether we can move to appropriations or other types of bills in the future. So in addition to all this stuff about the process and making sure that we make things perfect, we also just have to drive people to use Sbdcs and ask for help from a source that they may not have thought to ask for or have been turned away from before. So, you know, keep that in mind when you have another need as a worker co-op for technical assistance. It's not the usual suspects anymore. You may have another source.
Two more things to mention. One, around legislative support and next steps. One is to actually thank, if you are in the states where any of the senators who co-sponsored this are based, it's really, really helpful to reach out. I mean, yes, it has already passed, and it's still helpful to just double down and say, thank you so much. If you're in New Hampshire or any of these other states that were part, especially for, well, I guess both sides of the aisle, whatever your senator is, if they've been involved, definitely reach out and thank them. And secondly, Senator Bernie Sanders does have complementary legislation, which I think we're informally referring to as the Bank Act.
And the Work Act, yes.
And the Work Act, which have their own process. So we can talk about that, I think, at a future date, because I think we're out of time. You had a last couple announcements, Mo?
Yeah, so as Espan said, say thank you, and we are happy to help you say thank you. So after this call is over, we'll send you the recording, we'll send you all the information that we've talked about, and some more. So all the work that we're doing at the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives and with the Democracy at Work Institute, and we will send you all that in addition to like social media that will help you actually thank specifically the people in the different areas, which is really important, because what the thing that we need to do is give people ownership and say, hey, you made this thing happen. Yeah. We are so happy that you are pushing forward this legislation and that you have gotten it passed, and we are excited to work with you to move it forward. So that's just kind of how the phrasing should go when you're doing the outreach, and we're happy to do that. So a couple more announcements. As part of this work, we try to help the whole worker, right? So the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives is also provides vision and dental to our voting members, and we're about to go into open enrollment time. That's also coordinating with our annual census, which is understanding the data around all of the worker cooperatives and democratic workplaces across the country. So those are just some things that are coming up. And finally, if you have any questions, I saw there are a few questions from a news outlet or two, please reach out to us at policy@usworker.coop, and that will actually ensure that all of us get that communication so that we can gather your stories, talk back with you, and be able to continue the conversation. So yeah, as I said, you'll get the recording of this. We hope that you share it, and we really appreciate everyone's time. So
thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for looking today.
Working together more.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.